She hadn't played piano in front of anyone for 7 long years. Not once. Not even for her own family. And honestly, she never thought she would again. Her name was, and at 32 years old, she had made peace with the fact that her dream was over. At least, that's what she told herself every single day. You see, wasn't always invisible. There was a time when her name meant something in the world of classical music. At just 23 years old, she was being called a future legend. Music critics wrote about her. Concert halls wanted to book her. She had that rare gift where her fingers didn't just hit the keys. They made the piano sing. They made people cry. They made strangers in the audience feel things they couldn't even put into words. But life has a way of taking everything away in a single moment. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Was driving home from a rehearsal. She was preparing for what was supposed to be the biggest performance of her career. A solo concert at one of the most famous music halls in the country. She had worked her entire life for this moment. Then a truck ran a red light. The crash lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. When woke up in the hospital 3 days later, she couldn't feel her right hand. The doctors stood around her bed with serious faces. They told her the nerves in her hand were badly damaged. They told her she might never play again, not professionally, maybe not at all. Remembered staring at the ceiling that night, unable to cry. It was like her whole body had gone numb. Everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed about since she was 5 years old, was suddenly gone. The months that followed were the darkest of her life. She went through surgery after surgery. She spent hours in physical therapy trying to get her fingers to move the way they used to, but nothing worked the way it should. Her hand was stiff. Her fingers were slow. The music that once flowed out of her so naturally now felt trapped inside, with no way to escape. After 2 years of trying, gave up. She packed away her awards and her old concert programs. She stopped listening to classical music because it hurt too much. She moved to a small apartment in a quiet part of town and took a job as a piano tuner. It was ironic, really. She spent her days fixing pianos for other people to play. She would tune the keys perfectly, test them once or twice, and then walk away. She never stayed to play a full song. She couldn't bear it. Her younger sister was the only one who knew how much pain was still carrying. Would sometimes catch her staring at her right hand with this faraway look in her eyes, but she never pushed. She just waited, hoping that one day her sister would find her way back. That day seemed impossible, until the night of the charity gala. Had called 3 weeks before the event, practically begging her to come. It was a fancy fundraiser at the conservatory, one of the most respected music schools in the country. There would be live performances, important guests, and a silent auction to raise money for music education programs. Said no at first, then she said no again and again. But wouldn't give up. She told that she needed a +1, that she didn't want to go alone, that it would mean the world to her if it would just show up for one night. Finally, after the 5th phone call, gave in. On the night of the gala, she stood in front of her mirror for a long time. She wore a simple black dress that she hadn't touched in years. Her hair was pulled back, and she put on just a little makeup. She looked elegant, but tired. There were lines around her eyes now that hadn't been there before, lines that told the story of sleepless nights and quiet grief. When she arrived at the conservatory, felt her chest tighten. The building was grand and beautiful, with high ceilings and marble floors. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting a warm golden light on the crowd below. Everywhere she looked, she saw people in expensive clothes, holding glasses of champagne, talking about music like it was the most natural thing in the world. For them, it probably was, for it felt like walking through a graveyard of her own dreams. Squeezed her hand and whispered, "You okay?" Nodded, even though she wasn't sure. They found a table near the back of the room, away from the main stage. Was grateful for that. She could watch without being seen. She could listen without being noticed. The performances began shortly after. Students and faculty members took turns playing various pieces. Some were good, some were excellent. Found herself analyzing each one, noticing the little mistakes that most people in the audience would never catch. A slightly rushed tempo here, a missed dynamic there. Old habits, she supposed. Then came the main event. A man walked onto the stage and the room fell silent. He was tall, with slick-back hair and a perfectly tailored suit. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being told he was exceptional. His name was Preston Wells, and he was the star of the evening, a celebrated pianist who had performed in concert halls all over the world. He was talented, no doubt about it, but there was something cold about him, something arrogant. Had heard of him before. Years ago, when she was still performing, they had crossed paths at a competition. She remembered how he had looked at other musicians like they were beneath him, how he never shook hands with anyone he didn't consider his equal. Preston sat down at the grand piano and began to play. His technique was flawless. His fingers moved across the keys with precision and speed, but as listened, she felt something missing. There was no heart in his music, no soul. It was like watching a robot perform, perfect but empty. The audience didn't seem to notice. They clapped and cheered like they were witnessing something magical. During the intermission, excused herself and walked toward the stage. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she just wanted to see the piano up close. It was the same model she used to play on. She reached out and touched the keys gently, just for a moment. She didn't realize anyone was watching. A voice cut through the air behind her, sharp, mocking. "Careful with that. It costs more than you probably make in 10 years. Turned around. Preston Wells was standing a few feet away, a smug smile on his face. A small group of guests had gathered nearby, drawn by his voice. His heart pounded. She pulled her hand back from the piano, suddenly feeling like she had been caught doing something wrong. Preston stepped closer, looking her up and down like she was something he needed to inspect. His eyes landed on her right hand, and his smile grew wider. "Let me guess," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You took lessons as a kid, maybe played at a few recitals, and now you think touching a real instrument makes you special." A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Felt her face grow hot. She wanted to walk away. She wanted to disappear, but something kept her feet planted to the floor. Appeared at her side, ready to say something, but held up her hand. "I've played a little," said quietly. Preston raised an eyebrow. "Oh, have you?" He was enjoying this. She could see it in his eyes. He was bored, and she was his entertainment. What he didn't know was that it spent the last 5 years doing something in secret, something nobody knew about. Every night, alone in her apartment, she had been teaching herself to play again. She had rewired her brain to work around the damage. She had practiced until her hand cramped and her eyes burned with tears. She wasn't the same pianist she used to be. She was something new. And Preston Wells had no idea what he was about to walk into. Preston looked at her like she had just told him the funniest joke he had ever heard. His laugh was loud and sharp, and it echoed through the room. A few more people started to gather around them, curious about what was happening near the stage. "You've played a little," he repeated, shaking his head. "That's adorable, really. Let me guess. You can do a nice version of Happy Birthday at parties, maybe some Christmas songs during the holidays." The crowd chuckled, not everyone but enough to make feel small. Stepped forward, her face red with anger. "You don't know anything about her. You have no right to talk to her like that." Preston barely glanced at. His eyes stayed locked on like a cat watching a mouse. He was enjoying every second of this. "I'm just having a bit of fun," he said with a shrug. "No harm done. But honestly, it's people like you who think they can just walk up to a professional instrument and touch it like they belong here. You don't. This is a world for real musicians, not hobbyists." Felt something shift inside her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not sadness, Not embarrassment, something else. Anger. For 7 years she had stayed quiet. She had hidden away from the world. She had accepted that her time was over. But standing here, being talked down to by this man who had never struggled for anything in his life, something inside her started to wake up. Still, she kept her voice calm. I understand. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. She turned to walk away. That should have been the end of it. A small moment of humiliation, forgotten by tomorrow. But Preston wasn't done. Wait, he called out, his voice dripping with amusement. Hold on, I want to make this interesting. Stopped but didn't turn around. Since you say you've played a little, why don't we find out just how little? Preston continued. He was speaking louder now, making sure everyone nearby could hear. A friendly challenge, you and me, right here, right now. The crowd grew larger. People were whispering to each other, phones were coming out of pockets, and the energy in the room shifted. This was no longer just a charity gala. It was becoming a show. Grabbed's arm. Don't do this, you don't have to prove anything to him. But slowly turned around. Preston was standing by the piano now, one hand resting on its polished surface. He looked so sure of himself, so certain that he had already won. What kind of challenge? Asked. His smile grew wider. Simple. We each play one piece. The audience decides who did it better. If you manage to impress them, I'll donate an extra $10,000 to tonight's charity. That's on top of what I've already given. He paused, letting the number sink in. $10,000. It was a lot of money. Money that would go toward helping kids learn music. And if I don't impress them? Asked. Preston tilted his head like he was thinking about it, but knew he already had his answer ready. If you don't impress them, you leave. Quietly. No scene. And you never show up to another event like this again. You go back to whatever little life you came from and stay there. The crowd went silent. Even the people who had been laughing before looked uncomfortable now. This wasn't playful teasing anymore. This was cruel. Skripon's arm tightened. Please, let's just go. He's not worth it. Looked at her sister. She saw the worry in her eyes, the fear. Had watched her fall apart 7 years ago. She had seen her at her lowest. And now she was terrified of watching it happen again. But also saw something else in that moment. She saw all those nights she had spent alone in her apartment, struggling to move her fingers across the keys. She saw the tears she had cried when her hand wouldn't cooperate. She saw the hundreds of hours she had put in, with no audience, no applause, no one telling her she could do it. She had rebuilt herself in silence, and maybe it was time to stop being silent. Gently removed his hand from her arm. Okay, she said. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Preston blinked. For just a second, his confident expression flickered. He hadn't expected her to accept. Okay, he repeated. I'll do it, said. Her voice was steady now. Calm, I'll play. The crowd erupted in murmurs. People were pushing closer, trying to get a better view. Someone near the back shouted, "This is going to be good." Preston recovered quickly. His smile returned, sharper than before. Well, you've got some courage, I'll give you that. Stupid courage, but courage. He gestured toward the stage with a dramatic sweep of his arm. I'll even let you go second. That way you can see what real playing looks like before you embarrass yourself. Didn't respond. She just watched as Preston made his way to the piano, soaking in the attention like sunlight. Pulled her aside, her voice a harsh whisper. What are you doing? You haven't performed in public in 7 years. Your hand. What if it's not ready? Took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Was right. This was insane. She hadn't performed in front of anyone since the accident. She didn't know if her hand could handle the pressure. She didn't know if she could handle the pressure. But she also knew something else. She knew that if she walked away now, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been. She had already lost 7 years to fear and doubt. She wasn't willing to lose another moment. "I have to try," whispered back. "Even if I fail, I have to try." Looked at her for a long moment, then slowly she nodded. "Okay, then I'm right here, no matter what happens." Squeezed her sister's hand. On stage, Preston settled onto the piano bench. He adjusted his cuffs, rolled his shoulders, and placed his fingers on the keys. The room fell completely silent. Then he began to play. He chose one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano. It was fast, technical, and designed to show off. His fingers flew across the keyboard like they were barely touching it. Every note was perfect. Every rhythm was exact. He played like a machine built specifically for this purpose. The audience watched in awe. People nodded along. Some closed their eyes, swept up in the complexity of the music. When the final notes rang out, the applause was immediate and loud. Preston stood up and took a bow. He was glowing. He looked out at the crowd like a king surveying his kingdom. Then his eyes found. "Your turn," he said, stepping away from the piano and gesturing toward it like he was offering her a seat at her own execution. "Try not to hurt yourself." A few people laughed, but not as many as before. The mood had shifted. Some in the audience were starting to feel uncomfortable with how far Preston was pushing this. Walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She could hear the whispers. Who is she? Does she even know how to play? This is going to be painful to watch. She reached the piano and stood beside it for a moment. She looked down at the keys. They were white and black, simple and familiar. She had spent her whole life with these keys. They had been her best friends, her worst enemies, and everything in between. She sat down on the bench. The room went quiet again, so quiet she could hear her own breathing. Placed her hands on the keys. Her right hand trembled slightly. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. This was it. 7 years of silence. 7 years of pain. 7 years of fighting to get back to this moment. She opened her eyes. And she began to play. The first note came out soft, almost too soft. It floated into the silent room like a whisper, barely there at all. His fingers were shaking. She could feel it. She was sure everyone else could see it too. Her right hand felt stiff, like it always did when she was nervous. The old fear crept back into her chest. The voice in her head started whispering all the things she had been telling herself for 7 years. You can't do this anymore. You're broken. You don't belong here. Somewhere in the crowd she heard a man cough. Someone else shifted in their seat. She could feel their impatience, their doubt. They were already deciding that this was a mistake. Preston stood off to the side of the stage, his arms crossed over his chest. Even without looking at him, could feel his smirk burning into her back. She played another note, then another. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, finding their way through the opening of the piece she had chosen. It was a song she knew better than any other. The last piece she had ever performed before the accident. The piece that had haunted her dreams for 7 long years. But right now it didn't sound like a dream. It sounded like a struggle. His jaw tightened. Her shoulders were tense. She was trying too hard, thinking too much. Every note felt forced, like she was pushing the music out instead of letting it flow. In the audience, people exchanged glances. A woman in the front row looked down at her lap, embarrassed on his behalf. A man near the back shook his head slowly. This is a disaster, thought. I should stop. I should get up and walk away before it gets any worse. But then something happened. She thought about her sister, standing somewhere in that crowd, believing in her. She thought about all those nights alone in her apartment, crying into her pillow because her hand wouldn't work the way it used to. She thought about the little girl she had once been, the one who fell in love with the piano at 5 years old and never wanted to do anything else. That little girl didn't give up. That little girl fought. Closed her eyes. She stopped thinking about the audience. She stopped thinking about Preston. She stopped thinking about her damaged hand and all the doctors who told her she would never play again. She just let go. And the music changed. It started slowly at first. The notes began to connect in a way they hadn't before. The stiffness in her fingers melted away. Her right hand, the one that had caused her so much pain, started to move with a grace she had almost forgotten it possessed. The melody grew stronger, deeper. It filled the room like water filling a glass, rising higher and higher until there was no space left for anything else. Wasn't just playing the piano anymore. She was speaking through it. Every note carried something real, something true. The pain of losing everything she loved. The loneliness of those 7 years in silence. The tiny spark of hope that had refused to die no matter how hard she tried to bury it. In the audience, people started to notice. The woman who had looked away in embarrassment now lifted her head. Her eyes were wide. The man who had shaken his head was frozen in place, his mouth slightly open. Pressed her hand to her chest. Tears were already forming in her eyes. She had heard play 1,000 times when they were younger, but she had never heard her play like this. This wasn't just music. This was soul laid bare for everyone to see. The piece moved into its most difficult section. This was the part that required speed, precision, and strength. The part that had once performed flawlessly in concert halls around the world. The part that the doctors said she would never be able to play again. Her fingers flew across the keys, not perfectly, not like Preston's machine-like precision, but with something far more powerful. There were tiny imperfections here and there. A note that came a fraction of a second late, a chord that rang slightly uneven. But none of that mattered. Because the emotion behind every note was so overwhelming that the small mistakes became invisible. They were swallowed up by something much bigger, something that Preston, for all his technical skill, had never been able to create. Feeling. Raw, unfiltered, heartbreaking feeling. A woman in the middle of the crowd started to cry. She didn't even know why. The music just reached inside her and pulled something out. An older man nearby wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, pretending he wasn't affected. But he was, they all were. The music swelled toward its climax. His entire body was moving with the piano now. She leaned into the keys, her eyes still closed, completely lost in the world she was creating. The notes crashed like waves against rocks. They soared like birds breaking free from cages. They whispered like secrets shared between old friends. Preston's expression had changed. The smug smile was gone. In its place was something he had never felt before in his entire career. Doubt. He watched play, and for the first time, he understood what he had been missing all these years. He had spent his whole life chasing perfection, hitting every note exactly right, impressing audiences with his speed and his skill. But he had never made anyone feel anything. He had never played from a place of real pain, real struggle, real love. Because he had never known those things. Everything had always come easy to him. He had never had to fight for his music. He had never lost it and had to claw his way back. And that's why her music was reaching places his never could. The final section of the piece arrived. Fingers danced through the melody, building and building toward the end. The entire room held its breath. No one moved. No one made a sound. And then, with one last powerful chord, the music stopped. His hands lifted from the keys. She sat perfectly still, her eyes still closed, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was completely frozen. It was like everyone had forgotten how to move, how to speak, how to breathe. Then a single person started clapping. She stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face, her hands coming together over and over again. Another person joined her, then another, then 10 more. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. People shot to their feet. The applause was thunderous. It echoed off the walls and the high ceilings until it felt like the whole building was shaking. Strangers were hugging each other. Women were wiping tears from their cheeks. Men were shouting things like "incredible" and "who is she?" Finally opened her eyes. She looked out at the crowd, and for a moment she couldn't understand what she was seeing. All these people on their feet clapping for her, crying for her, celebrating her. It had been so long since she had felt this, so long since she had let anyone hear her play. She had almost forgotten what it was like to be seen. Her eyes found in the crowd. Her sister was sobbing now, both hands pressed over her heart. She nodded as if to say, I always knew you could do it. Felt something break open inside her chest, not in a painful way, in a freeing way, like a door that had been locked for 7 years was finally swinging open. She turned her head slowly and looked at Preston. He was still standing at the side of the stage, but he wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't crossing his arms with that arrogant confidence he had worn all night. He was just standing there, pale, silent, defeated. And for the first time in his life, Preston Wells had nothing to say. The applause went on and on. It seemed like it would never stop. People were still on their feet, still clapping, still wiping tears from their eyes. Some of them had their phones out now, recording the moment, wanting to capture something they knew they might never see again. Sat at the piano bench, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't know what to do. She had imagined this moment so many times over the past 7 years. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she would close her eyes and picture herself performing again. Picture the audience clapping. Picture herself feeling whole again. But she had never really believed it would happen. Now that it was real, she felt like she was floating outside her own body, like she was watching everything from somewhere far away. Pushed through the crowd and rushed toward the stage. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't care about being polite. She just ran straight to her sister and wrapped her arms around her. "You did it," whispered into his ear, her voice breaking. "You really did it. I'm so proud of you." Hugged her back, holding on tight. For a moment the two sisters just stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, while the crowd continued to cheer around them. When they finally pulled apart, noticed something strange happening near the front of the room. An older man was making his way through the crowd. He walked slowly, using a wooden cane for support, but there was something powerful about his presence. People stepped aside for him without being asked. They looked at him with respect, with reverence. Didn't recognize him at first. It had been so many years. But when he got closer, when she saw his face clearly in the light of the chandeliers, her heart nearly stopped. His name was Dr. Bernard. He was one of the most respected figures in the entire world of classical music, a former conductor who had led some of the greatest orchestras on the planet, a mentor who had shaped the careers of countless musicians, a legend. And once, a long time ago, he had been his teacher. She had studied with him for 2 years before the accident. He had believed in her when no one else did. He had pushed her harder than anyone. He had told her she had the potential to be one of the greats. Then the accident happened and disappeared from the music world. She had been too ashamed to contact him, too broken to face anyone from her old life. Now here he was, standing right in front of her. Doctor stopped at the edge of the stage. His eyes were soft, but there was something intense behind them, something searching. He said quietly, just her name, nothing else. That single word hit her like a wave. She felt her eyes sting with fresh tears. "Doctor," she managed to say, I didn't know you would be here." He smiled just slightly. "I almost didn't come. These events bore me, to be honest, but something told me I should be here tonight." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "Now I know why." The crowd had grown quieter now. People were watching this exchange, sensing that something important was happening, even if they didn't fully understand it. Doctor took another step closer. I looked for you, after the accident. I tried to find you, but you vanished. No phone calls, no letters, nothing. Looked down at her hands. I couldn't face you. I couldn't face anyone. I thought my life was over. And yet here you are, he said gently, playing better than you ever did before. Shook her head. I made mistakes. My hand isn't what it used to be. I'm not the same. Doctor reached out and took her right hand in both of his. He held it carefully, like it was something precious. You're right, he said. You're not the same. You're better. What you just played, that wasn't technique. That wasn't training. That was truth. That was pain turned into beauty. He squeezed her hand softly. That is what music is supposed to be. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People were starting to realize who was. Whispers spread like fire. Wait, is that Vance? The Vance, the one who disappeared. I thought she couldn't play anymore. Oh my God, I remember her. She was supposed to be the next big thing. The whispers grew louder. More people pulled out their phones. The story was already spreading beyond the walls of the conservatory. Preston, who had been standing frozen at the side of the stage this whole time, suddenly looked uncomfortable. His face had gone from pale to slightly green. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly wanting to disappear. But Doctor wasn't done. The old man turned slowly, his cane tapping against the stage floor until he was facing Preston directly. You, Doctor said. His voice was no longer soft. It was cold, sharp. I watched your performance earlier, technically perfect, emotionally empty. You play like someone who has never struggled for anything in his life. Preston opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Doctor continued. And then you stood here and mocked this woman, a woman who lost everything and fought her way back, a woman who has more courage in her damaged hand than you have in your entire being. The crowd was completely silent now. No one dared to breathe. Preston's face twisted. He was trying to find his arrogance again, trying to summon that smug confidence that had always protected him. But it wouldn't come. It was just a bit of fun, he stammered. I didn't know who she was. It wouldn't matter if she was nobody, Doctor shot back. The way you treated her was disgraceful. You don't lift yourself up by pushing others down. That's not what music is about. That's not what being human is about. Preston looked around the room, searching for support, for anyone who might take his side. But all he found were cold stares and disapproving faces. The same people who had laughed at his jokes earlier were now looking at him like he was something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of their shoes. For the first time in his life, Preston Wells understood what it felt like to be small. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off the stage. He pushed through the crowd, keeping his head down, and disappeared through a side door. No one tried to stop him. No one called after him. He was simply gone. The room seemed to exhale. The tension that had been building all night finally broke. Doctor turned back too. His expression softened again. I owe you an apology, he said. Blinked in surprise. What? Why would you owe me an apology? Because I should have found you, he said. I should have tried harder. I should have told you that your worth as a musician was never about your hands. It was about your heart. And your heart was never broken. It was just waiting. Couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. Appeared at her side again, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. You did it, said again, her voice thick with emotion. You really did it. But shook her head. No, she said quietly, we're not done yet. She turned to look at the piano, the beautiful that had just given her back something she thought she had lost forever. There was still one more thing she needed to do. And she knew exactly what it was. Stepped back toward the piano. The crowd watched her, confused but curious. They had just witnessed something incredible. They had seen a woman rise from the ashes and silence her critic. What more could there possibly be? Reached for her arm. "What are you doing?" But just smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't worn in 7 years. She turned to face the audience. Her voice was soft at first, but it carried through the silent room like it was meant to reach every single person there. "7 years ago," she began, "I was in a car accident. The doctors told me I would never play piano again. They said the damage to my hand was too severe. They said I should find a new dream." She paused, letting the words settle. "For a long time I believed them. I gave up. I hid from the world. I thought that if I couldn't be the pianist I used to be, then I was nothing." A few people in the crowd nodded. They understood that feeling. The feeling of losing something so important that you don't know who you are without it. "But then I realized something," continued. "I realized that music was never about being perfect. It was never about impressing people or winning competitions or proving that I was better than someone else." Her eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on the door where Preston had disappeared. "Music is about connection. It's about taking the pain and the joy and the fear and the hope inside of you and turning it into something that other people can feel. It's about being human, and being human means being broken sometimes. It means struggling. It means falling down and finding a way to get back up." The room was completely still. No one moved, no one whispered, they just listened. "I spent 5 years teaching myself to play again," said. "Alone, in secret. I didn't tell anyone because I was afraid that I would fail, afraid that people would laugh at me, afraid that I would never be good enough." She looked down at her right hand, the hand that had betrayed her, the hand that had also saved her. "But tonight, I learned something important. I learned that the only person I ever needed to prove anything to was myself, and I finally did." The crowd erupted into applause again, but held up her hand, asking them to wait. "There's one more thing," she said. She turned to look at Doctor, who was watching her with pride shining in his old eyes. "The challenge tonight was for $10,000, said. "If I impressed the audience, that money would go to charity, to help children learn music." She turned back to the crowd. "I don't want $10,000. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Reached into the small purse she had brought with her. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and worn, like it had been carried around for a very long time. "When I was 6 years old," she said, "my parents couldn't afford piano lessons. We didn't have money for that kind of thing. But there was a program at a local community center. A free program for kids who wanted to learn music but couldn't pay for it. That program changed my life. It gave me everything." She unfolded the paper. It was a faded certificate from that program. A simple piece of paper with her name on it, awarded for completing her first year of lessons. "I've carried this with me ever since," said. "Even when I stopped playing, even when I thought I would never touch a piano again, because it reminded me of where I came from, and it reminded me that someone somewhere believed I was worth investing in." She looked out at the wealthy donors and important guests who filled the room. "So I don't want $10,000, she repeated. "I want more. I want everyone in this room to dig deep tonight. I want you to think about some kid out there who loves music but can't afford lessons. Some kid who might change the world if someone just gives them a chance." She paused. "I'll start. I don't have much, but I'm donating everything I have in my savings account. $5,000. The room gasped. For someone who worked as a piano tuner, $5,000 was not a small amount. It was probably months of income, maybe more. But wasn't finished. "And I'm also making a promise," she said. "Starting next month, I'm going to volunteer at community centers. I'm going to teach kids who can't afford lessons for free. Because someone did that for me once, and it's time I passed it on." The applause that followed was different from before. It wasn't just admiration. It was respect. Deep, genuine respect. Doctor stepped forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. "I'll match whatever this room donates tonight," he announced. "Every single dollar." The crowd buzzed with excitement. Hands went up all over the room. People were calling out numbers: 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. By the end of the night, the charity had raised over $300,000, more than triple what they had expected. But the money wasn't the most important part. After the crowd finally began to thin out, she found herself standing alone near the piano. The room was quieter now. Most of the guests had left, still buzzing about what they had witnessed. Walked up beside her. So said softly, "What happens now?" Thought about it for a moment. She looked at the piano. She looked at her hands. She looked at the empty stage where Preston had stood just a few hours ago, so full of arrogance and cruelty. "I don't know," admitted, "but for the first time in 7 years I'm excited to find out." Smiled and leaned her head against her sister's shoulder. "You know," said, "I always knew you'd play again someday, even when you didn't believe it. Even when you told me to stop hopping, I never stopped." Felt tears prick her eyes again. But this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." "Never," said, "that's what sisters are for." They stood there for a long moment, just the two of them, in the quiet of the empty hall. Then Doctor appeared. He walked slowly toward them, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He said, "I have a proposal for you." She turned to face him. "What kind of proposal?" His eyes twinkled. "There's a concert next spring, a big one, at the same hall where you were supposed to perform 7 years ago, the one you never got to play." His breath caught in her throat. "I have some influence with the organizers," Doctor continued. "If you're interested, I could make a call, get you a spot on the program." Stared at him, her heart was pounding. "You want me to perform at that hall?" Doctor nodded. "I think it's time you finish what you started, don't you?" Looked at, her sister's eyes were wide with excitement. Then she looked back at Doctor. For 7 years she had been afraid of failing, afraid of being laughed at, afraid of hopping for something and having it taken away again. But tonight had changed everything. She had faced her fear. She had silenced her doubters. She had proven to herself that she was still here, still fighting, still alive. And she wasn't going to hide anymore. "Yes," said, her voice was steady, strong. "I'll do it." Doctor smiled. A warm, proud smile that made feel like she was 6 years old again, sitting at a piano for the very first time, discovering that her fingers could make magic. "Good," he said. "Then let's show the world what you're made of." Looked back at the piano one last time. The gleamed under the soft lights, waiting for her. She had spent 7 years in silence. Now it was time to make some noise.